Hi folks, Lou here to talk about a team sport because it's a game, even though it's not the kind of game I usually talk about, which is video games or tabletop games. And it's something that is designed, although it's not designed by an individual. Now, I'm not a futurist, but I am a game designer, so I can suggest whatever changes may occur in soccer despite the extreme conservatism of the sport. I watch a lot of soccer. When both teams go for it, soccer can be hugely entertaining. Unfortunately, that often doesn't happen. Now, international football, soccer, is extremely conservative. It puts even ice hockey to shame. There's a notion amongst many fans that it's still a sport played at highest levels for reasons other than money. In other words, amateurism is supposedly still involved. Well, that's hokum, but that's the way a lot of people feel. And we could see that when a European Super League was suggested, including teams from France and Spain and England and Italy and Germany. The vehement reaction against it was amazing. And much of it was because, oh, these people want to make money. Well, yeah. And oh, this is not the spirit of soccer, it's amateurism. But, already there's huge money involved in soccer. One playoff game in England is worth over $150 million because one team gets promoted to the Premier League and another one doesn't. 1.9 billion pounds, I think it was, got spent on transfers this summer just by the English teams. But people want to pretend that soccer is the same game, whether it's played in a sandlot or before 100,000 people. That's what I call the amateur notion. And that's where the extreme conservatism comes from. Video review, which we've had in other sports for a very long time, was adopted only a few years ago and was so poorly executed that some wanted to get rid of it. And there's still a lot of complaints about it. What are called talking points are revered by spectators. I guess what you talk about in the pub at halftime or during the after the game. Sometimes it seems as though fans want referees to make controversial calls so they have something to talk about. So I'll rate the likelihood of each suggestion I discuss on a 5 scale, with 5 being most likely. So the first one is to have 2 referees on the field. This is not likely to be adopted because almost nobody talks about it. And this is true even though there are so many officiating errors that finally led to video review, but there's still just 1 referee on the field and 2 so-called assistant referees, otherwise known as linesmen, who do not come on the field, so they're very far away and who have very limited authority. Now, soccer field, of course, is very large. There's plenty of room for 2 referees, but there are a lot of people who just don't understand how you can have 2 referees because they disagree with each other. Well, of course, in other team sports, there's more than 2 referees, at least in the United States versions of those sports. But soccer people tend to ignore everything that happens in other sports. Contrast this attitude with basketball and hockey, which recently added 1 referee each for 3 in basketball and 2 plus 2 linesmen in hockey. Of course, there are 7 officials in American football and 4 or 6 in the playoffs in baseball. With 2 refs, a ref would be closer to many plays than now, and the referees wouldn't be forced to retire early if they didn't need to run as far, because referees for soccer retire much earlier than referees for some other sports because they have to do so much moving around. That wouldn't happen if there were 2 refs. Another one which has partially been accomplished now is more substitutes. Soccer has a history of emphasizing endurance over skill. In living memory, there were no substitutes allowed, even if someone was severely injured, like a broken leg. Too bad, your team just plays 1 man short. And the game was very rough, it's much rougher than today. So even now, 3 substitutes have only just been superseded by 5, mostly thanks to the pandemic. And there's now 1 additional sub allowed during extra time in tournaments. The Women's World Cup decided that all team members will either be in the game or on the bench. And it used to be only 7 were allowed on the bench, but still just 5 subs. Contrast this with American college hockey, where there's more or less unlimited substitutions that occur during play, the same way that substitutions occur in ice hockey, with the one limit that once you come out of a half, you can't go back in until the next half. Another thing that's really needed is a clock operator. Hockey, American football, basketball all have clock operators, even down to high school and lower levels. In soccer, the referee wears a watch and time is continuous, with some added on at the end of a half, very primitive. It's terribly imprecise and it encourages all kinds of time wasting. If you had a clock that stopped when the ball wasn't in play, lots of the cheating, such as fake injuries and other time wasting, would disappear. The referee's job would become easier too. But resistance to this comes from the amateur notion. We can't have too many officials involved in the game because you can't do that when you're playing on a sand lot. I have seen this suggested all of once in all the reading I've done about soccer for many years, primarily about European soccer. So I think it will happen sooner or later, but it may be after my time, who knows. A sin bin, which is what they call what we have in ice hockey, where somebody gets penalized and goes off the field for a while, is talked about a lot, but I don't think it's going to be adopted. Recently, this was added to rugby, but it's pretty rare that somebody is penalized to the point where they go to the sin bin, and yet it seems to make a lot of difference in the play. But in soccer, when it's 10 players versus 11 players, that doesn't seem to be much of an advantage. So the sin bin, especially for a few minutes, just wouldn't do much. So I don't see sin bins happening, but it did in rugby, which is another game that originated in Britain, so you never know. Now, I like the 3 yellow system, but I think this is unlikely to be adopted. As it stands now, when a player gets 2 yellows, he's sent off and he cannot be replaced. It's the equivalent of a red card. So refs are reluctant to give a yellow for minor offenses, so players keep committing them. For example, standing over an opponent's free kick happens all the time. It is illegal. You're supposed to immediately get 10 yards away. But the referees feel that's too much for a yellow card. When 2 yellows is you're out. And so they don't give them yellow cards and people keep doing it. And the same for faking injuries and the same for delaying things coming back into play. Now, if you had a system where 3 yellows equal a red, and the ref can decide to give 2 yellows, you might call it an orange, for a serious offense, and the refs are instructed to book the minor defenses, then we'll see an awful lot less of the stupid cheating, is what it is, that's just not given a yellow card now. Now, I believe this is the last one, and this is the one that is very likely to be adopted, although it's not talked about in soccer circles. But older fans will remember when ice hockey was played without helmets. Now it's a hard helmet with compulsory clear plastic visor, and in college you have a full cage protecting the face. American football helmets are a lot different than they were in early days when they were leather and there was no mask. So there changes have been made. Why do we need changes in soccer? Because a lot of players, older players, have been shown to have brain damage from having headed the ball a lot, especially when the ball was a lot heavier than it is now. So sooner or later, there are going to be multi-million-dollar lawsuits which will threaten the football associations with ruin. Already in the USA, younger children are no longer allowed to head the ball. It's inevitable that head protection of some kind, perhaps something like the skull cap that Petr Cech wore because of a prior concussion, will be required. But as usual in soccer, there's a lot of resistance. Why should there be so much resistance to wearing helmets when they're worn in many other sports? Well, interestingly enough, even in rugby, people don't wear helmets. So in Britain, they're not used to it. And the British have a lot of pull in the rules-making bodies because they have 4 countries, Northern Ireland, England, Scotland, and Wales. Nonetheless, I think in the end, lawsuits will make them adopt something to protect players' heads. On the other hand, you just never know what soccer will do. They still swear by relegation and promotion, even though that's a terrible business plan. But keep in mind, amateur, that's the way they think of it. Thanks for listening.